Disasters and catastrophes have often inspired artists to render their terrible beauty onto canvas or set them in stone, and on occasion ink their ways into comic panels. More so in comics are creators allowed to convey narration, a protracted storytelling, as opposed to the usual frozen singular moment in a singular painting. Comics and the utility of the panels offer to the creator as well as the reader interconnected visuals imbricated in a foregrounding story of disaster. Though depiction of disasters in comics is nothing new, the Philippines' experience of politicizing disasters has inflected through the pages and panels of certain local comics. This presentation looks on the works of Romel Estanislao. He produced a comic strip because he was directly affected by a typhoon and the ensuing lack of government support. This presentation aims to discuss the ways in which disasters are depicted to warrant a discourse on how disaster is visualized and deployed as a narrative implement and to whose gain. Comics are not stuff of monuments, but they can deal with monumentality. This year's theme of the International Visual Methods Conference hinges on small stories, which are often overlooked for the grand narratives many insist as the mileage for history. Comics has been not just about small stories, but comics as a medium has been seen with the usual derision precisely for its smallness. Comics are seen as small. Some discard comics as mere entertainment. Some say comics are disposable fluff and incapable of mining difficult subjects. However, people forget that it is precisely the smallness of comics as a medium is where its narrative power comes from. Comics are the very fount of small stories. In its panels, it can render difficult subjects like the Holocaust, political upheavals, affliction into tiny, digestible bits of stories while maintaining the gravity of the situation. My presentation is to showcase small stories in small panels of monumental disasters that are cyclical in my country, the Philippines. These are climate-related disasters and the inefficiency of our government and retardation of our political will as systemic. In this presentation, the Filipino comics creator no longer showcased just thoughts and prayers, but his anger and frustration over the disasters in which Filipinos are affected. As part of the small stories of a typhoon's aftermath, many Filipino media outlets look for stories of resilience, that the Filipino spirit is, quote, waterproof, end quote, and can take on the hardships of any disasters. This media-propagated resilience is what inept governments like that of the Philippines needs to lessen the demands for proactivity and accountability. The typhoon depicted in this comics in this presentation is Katsana, locally known as Ondoy, in 2009. Though it happened 10 years ago, Ondoy caused billions of dollars worth of damages, scores of lives have been lost, and severely affected the presidential administration of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo from 2001 to 2010, with massive political implications that still reverberate to this day. Hinging on Gillian Rose's semiology, which is, quote, choosing the images on the basis of how conceptually interesting they are, selecting images that will make their point well, analyze processes of meaning-making that are socially significant, end quote. This presentation works with a Filipino-made comic strip dealing with a typhoon that impacted a political reawakening. Political commentary has always been there, but it has been made sharper when the one commenting is directly affected by the disaster. The small stories of experiences allow a movement against monumentality of politics and institutionalized idiocy. The value of comics is in its sheer ability to directly engage with the viewers because of its accessibility. Quote, from this point of view, popular culture is not simply a text to be read singularly and authoritatively by the analyst or social actor. Rather, popular cultural forms must be understood as sites for struggles over meaning, identity, and representation, end quote, from Costa and Matzner, 2002. It is precisely that cartoons as sites for struggle over meaning and the ramifications, revisions across time that make this art form vital in navigating through history, current events, ideologies, and plotting out the possible consequences and mapping implications. These cartoons are implements of, quote, cultural conditioning of these behaviors and reactions as a form of explanation, but also to predict the line of future behavior and reactions towards specific problems, unquote, Alatas 2006. Arguably, these, quote, behaviors, end quote, are highlighted as how people navigate while in and through a disaster, particularly floods. These published images showcase a stark visual ideology of entrenched powers of the politicians, the constituents, and how each responds to climate disasters. The comics are implements of power imbricated in formation of public opinion as well as an engagement with an issue. On one side, these comics offer a respite of rash commentary against a failed system. Then, on the other side, comics are used as propaganda to deodorize certain politicians. Comics can lay bare the aspects of such conditioning. As such systems can be questioned as well, with many of the cartoonists take to task. In 2009, Manila and several provinces of the main Philippine island of Luzon were affected by the typhoon Ondoy, which clocked in about 160 kilometers per hour. In a matter of 6 hours, reports of rising flood, rivers bursting their banks have prompted a declaration of calamity from the Philippine government, enabling the usage of various government agencies in aid of recovery. On record, Ondoy affected millions of Filipinos and have seen widespread damage in the capital of Manila not seen in several years. Hardest hit are those who live near the Marikina River, which saw a swelling of the currents and sweeping shanties with families stuck on the roofs of their homes that had been submerged in the flood. Even the considerably wealthy were affected with flooding in their enclaves. Among those affected are numerous cartoonists whose works, collection, property were inundated by the flood. One of them is the cartoonist Romel Estanislao Jr. His works are of single panels that have been collected as one anthology. He has independently published this and sells this in local comic conventions. The collection known as Langoy, which is swim in Filipino, Ondoy Ground Zero, The Awakening, recounts his experience, observations, and commentary after having been through the Typhoon Katsana. In this collection of hilarious and disturbing vignettes, or small stories, so to speak, we see the cartoonist as journalist as well as chronicler making notes on how Ondoy, the Typhoon Ondoy, has affected his life and his community's cohesion. Arguably, Estanislao employed visual methodologies to ascertain the condition of living in and living through a climate disaster. His works are rectangular panels which host a situation arising from the flood and its consequences. Many of his observations are poignant as well as acerbic. In the culmination of the collection, Estanislao offers a dedication page to those that were victims of Ondoy. In lower right, with similar comics identified typography, he declares in a smaller font size, "Me Too, a Victim." This point of view privileges him as not just a distant commentator, but somebody who has gone through the motions of recovery post-Ondoy. This gives him a sense of authenticity and not just second-hand information. In the aftermath of the Typhoon Ondoy, many shirts, many posters, memes, messages flaunt the Filipino, quote, spirit, end quote, of resilience. This has been blared in the media that we Filipinos shall overcome given our inner strength. This mediated curation of resilience is dangerous because it normalizes accepting attitudes towards weak or absent disaster management. That it is expected of us to be flooded, which is okay because we are resilient. To complain is an act of weakness. We shall grin and bear it. This mythologizing resilience takes away the agency from Filipinos that to be a good, proud Filipino is to react accordingly, quietly, meekly, and dutifully clean out the mess. that we should work on preparation for disasters instead of questioning the government's severe lack of response and preparation. The government is an absent entity in most cases in how many of these strips have articulated. One such brilliant cartoon is that of somebody handing out relief goods to an elderly woman. The man in the middle looks at the camera and not at the victim. The cameraman does an okay sign, meaning he is getting the sweet footage for primetime news that is basically a public relations stunt. One of the best details in this strip is the label putik, or mud, near the shirt of the official. This is an acerbic pointing out that he, the official, is dressed for disaster relief of having the badge or proof that he too is undergoing this disaster, which is carefully curated to be captured by the media. Note that despite the muddied shirt, the official's hair is not unkempt compared to the grandmother's harried look with strands sticking all over her head. The official says to the evacuee, "Grandmother, don't look at the camera. Look at what I am handing you." The grandmother has an exasperated look, with her muttering under her breath, "But I thought..." Well, all these assumptions, when we assume it's incorrect. She's commenting that she assumed that the official is here to see the constituents and hand out relief. Instead, it was a chance for precious airtime. Disaster management is a class issue. The government has been criticized for ignoring the marginalized sectors in times of disaster. In the Philippines, where typhoons are an annual occurrence, class structures take a hit, particularly during Ondoy, where enclaves of the rich were flooded as well. Reports of a house owner in a wealthy neighborhood who was killed when the walls weakened and collapsed on him due to flooding were highlighted because the case showed that even the rich were affected. It is no longer the usual people in poverty-stricken areas that are flooded this time. In this strip, it shows a row of houses where the labels from left, wealthy, middle class, the poor. All three are submerged, but the only wealthy person's house has the roof sticking out. Among the three houses, it is the poor person's house of flimsy materials that is sinking on its side. In many communities, many of the informal settlers are located in vulnerable areas. In what used to be mangroves in certain coastlines, it is now being dotted by shanty towns in Manila. Literally, the first people to be directly hit by the typhoon and directly affected are the poor. Climate justice should address the economic realities of sheer inequality and inaccessibility to institutions and information that often elude the poor. One of the angriest cartoons in Stanislao is trained against the then Philippine President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. Throughout the anthology, you might observe the cartoons of a grim, boisterous humor to lighten the situation. But this cartoon featuring Macapagal Arroyo is clear in its anger. Macapagal Arroyo is portrayed as seated in a grand presidential chair, but lolling underwater. She is, however, inside a thought balloon from a person being violently swept away by the floods. The person does not warrant a face, but a dismembered foot amidst the debris. This depersonalization is not just rendering it anonymous, but perhaps an articulation of a common thought that is not openly uttered. This is why Stanislao belies the notion of quiet resilience, that there must be a dignified sifting through the damage. Resilience is a mythology espoused by an absent government. Resilience takes vast emotional reserve of getting through interconnected trials brought by disasters, and you are expected to bear this. There is no anger, no indignation, no protracted calls for change. Comics makes the case for channeling this anger into small stories within the panels. Despite the terrible tragedies of these disasters, comics can provide relief, and not just gags, but as a means of catharsis, and more importantly, addressing when fissures have been claimed and exposed, thus highlighting the problem of a system that is not quite working with regards to disaster management. From gags and grim commentary, Comics are no longer disposable, but a viable avenue to make sense of disasters, be it natural or institutional. Thank you.